first and foremost. Whether or not we're willing to adopt a different orientation, a posture, a stance in relationship to our community. Are we willing to turn outward to our communities, or will we be turned inward? And I don't need to tell you, so many of the organizations, most of the organizations I work with, United Way Worldwide, America's Promise, public broadcasting, arts groups, faith-based groups, so many of us are turned inward. We're more concerned about our organization than we are the community. We're more focused on process than we are people. We spend more time talking about inputs than we do impact. We're more concerned, we're almost like what I'd call activity happy and action deprived. Activity happy and action deprived. And it seems to me, if we want to get the work done in this country that we're all here to do, we need to first turn outward and change our posture. We need to be facing toward the community we want to serve, not inward towards ourselves. And so I want to ask you 3 questions for you to think about as you go home from here. 3 questions about turning outward. The first one is this. If I asked you if I could follow you in your community, and I asked you to come to a room like this in a community where you're working, and I asked 150 people that you know, or that are in that community that you don't know actually, to come into that room, 150 people, just like this morning, and I asked you to stand up on this table, and to look those people in the eyes, and to tell them not about AARP, but about their concerns, about their aspirations, about the things that keep them awake at night, about the things that they want to create change around. Could you do it? Could you do it? My rabbi's here. I once asked him, good friend of mine, I once asked him if he could do this. I go to one of the smallest congregations in Washington, D.C. Newsweek named us one of the top 25 congregations in all of America for being a vibrant community. But I once asked Danny, I said, Danny, if I asked 150 of our fellow congregants to come into our sanctuary one day, and I asked you to stand up on the table and not to talk to them about Judaism, but to talk to them about their lives, their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, could you do it? Could you do it? And in that moment, he was brave enough to say, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. What about each of us? What about each of us? I'm not saying that the only agenda is the community's agenda. We need to find the connecting point between what the community cares about and what AARP's mission is all about. But we cannot find that connection point if we do not understand the community. And turning outward requires that we find that intersection point between the community's interests, AARP's mission, so that we can do work that is authentic and real in the life of the community. Second question. Am I living up to the pledges and promises I make? Am I living up to the pledges and promises I make? And notice I didn't say, have you fulfilled? Are you living up? Are you moving in the right direction? And here, I'm not talking about the strategies we all have. We all have them. I'm not talking about the matrix charts we all use. I'm not talking about the PowerPoint decks we all have. I'm not talking about any of that. What I'm talking about is this. When you go home at the end of the day and you find a room that you can sit in by yourself with no one else there, just like I was in that courtyard at Dachau, and you're sitting in that room and you close your eyes in that silence, my question to you is, do you believe in that moment of truth that you're living up to the pledges and promises you've made to your community and in the work that we're doing? Are we living up to the essence of the pledges and promises we've made? That's a question I'd ask you to think about. Third question. Am I staying true to my urge within? What I would call my urge within. You know, each of us, long before we ever walked through this door to come into this room, each of us had an urge within us. Some of us, it developed very early in our lives, for others of us much later on in our lives. But we each have it. We each have it. It's what gets us up every morning. It's what propels us forward. What I've found is the most precious gift we have, because it enables us to do the work that we do. Except in our society, too often, this urge that we have, it gets denigrated. It gets discarded. It gets pushed aside. We're told not to worry too much about it. Just stay focused on your plan. Just implement your strategy. Just make sure you meet your budget. And what I'm here to tell you this morning is, even if you meet your budget, even if you implement your plans, even if you follow every page in that PowerPoint deck, if we are not staying true to our urge within, what are we doing? Toward what end are we working? What is our purpose in doing the work that we're doing? And what, I ask you, will sustain you when hard times come? Because it is this precious gift that is from within us that enables us to keep going day after day, particularly in the face of adversity, and particularly right now, when all we're talking about is what we're against. And it seems to me we need to start a conversation in this country about what we're for. About what we're for. This notion of turning outward reminds me of a story, a time when I was working in Flint, Michigan. I know Jacqueline's here from Michigan. It reminds me of our time working in Flint, Michigan about 15 years ago. We had been working there for a number of years, listening to community about their aspirations and their concerns, and we wanted to report back to the community what we had heard. So one night we decided to invite everyone we had touched in the community, which was hundreds of people, to come to the Ramada Inn on Saginaw Street. And this was in January. It was in the dead of winter. And unfortunately for us, that night there was a blizzard in Michigan. And if you've ever been in a blizzard in Michigan, you know you can't see very far or get very far. It was cold, it was dark, it was snowy, and there we were in the Ramada thinking, my God, no one's going to show up. And then, one by one, the good people of Flint got on their coats, got on their boots, got in their car, and they made their way to the Ramada. And one by one, they walked through the door of that hotel into that room. And as I told them about the results, I said to them, so now what do you think should happen in the community? And first, someone raised their hand and said, well, I think the mayor needs to do something. And out of the corner of my eye over here to my right, I could see a gentleman whose name I came to know as Mr. Brooks. You know how when you're in a meeting sometimes and someone leans forward, it looks like they want to talk? But I looked at Mr. Brooks and he was sort of leaning forward toward me. But you know when sometimes someone does that and then they shake you off? Mr. Brooks shook me off. And so I went to another person and they got up and said, well, you know, what I think needs to happen is United Way needs to do something. And again, to my right, I could see Mr. Brooks. And again, it looked like he wanted to say something. And again, he shook me off. Again, he shook me off. And so someone stood up and said, well, you know, I think the Community Foundation needs to fund X, Y, and Z project. And then I saw Mr. Brooks again. And this time, he was leaning forward. And this time, he was ready. And like a lot of us in this room, he was an older gentleman, about 30 years old. What we're all hoping for again, right? As a member of AARP, I can say that. And I'm sure Mr. Brooks was a member of AARP. Mr. Brooks was an older gentleman, and just like a lot of us at that point, in order to get up, he grabbed the side of the table with both hands and pulled himself up. And what I came to know is that he was a short man, too. But there, among hundreds of people, he stood. And he just looked out across the crowd, his neighbors from Flint, other folks from Flint who he didn't know. And he stood there in a moment of silence. And then he uttered 3 words which I will never forget. 3 words. What about us? What about us? What are we in this room? Not the Community Foundation, not the mayor, not the local United Way. What are we going to do? What about us? In that moment, Mr. Brooks stood up and declared his